What does it take to break a human being? Not their bones, not their body, but their mind, their soul, their grip on what's real and what's nightmare. This isn't a story about someone who was born broken. This is about someone who was made that way, someone ordinary, someone like you, someone like me. His name was Eli, and by the time the world noticed him, he was already screaming into the void, but nobody could hear him anymore, because the screaming had moved inside. This is the story of how innocence dies, how trauma doesn't just wound, it rewires, and how madness isn't what you think it is. It's not sudden. It's not random. It's the final, desperate gasp of a soul that's been drowning for decades. Stay with me, because if you've ever felt like you're losing your grip, this story will show you why. And maybe, just maybe, how to find your way back. Part 1. Introduction to Eli's Innocence and Early Trauma. Eli was 6 years old when he learned that love could have teeth. He was a curious child, the kind who asked too many questions, who wanted to understand why the sky changed colors and where the moon went during the day. He had wonder in his eyes, that pure, unfiltered fascination that only children possess before the world teaches them to be afraid. But Eli's home wasn't a place where wonder was welcomed. His father's rage arrived like thunderstorms, sudden, violent, and without warning. A dropped glass, a forgotten chore, a look that lasted too long. Any of these could ignite an explosion that would shake the walls and shatter the evening. His mother's silence was worse. She moved through the house like a ghost, present but absent, her eyes glazed with a resignation that said she'd given up fighting years ago. The fights weren't even about anything real. They were about everything and nothing. His father screaming about respect, about being ignored, about how nobody appreciated what he did. His mother's cold responses, weaponized quiet, the kind that cut deeper than any words. And Eli, small and terrified, learned to make himself invisible. He'd hide in his room, pressing his hands against his ears, trying to unhear the sounds of dishes breaking, doors slamming, his own name being used as ammunition in their war. But here's what nobody tells you about growing up in a war zone. It's not just the violence that destroys you, it's the gaslighting. The next morning, his father would be calm, almost cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "What are you so upset about?" he'd ask if Eli seemed withdrawn. "Stop being so sensitive." His mother would cook breakfast in silence and the house would pretend. The message was clear: your reality isn't real. What you experienced didn't happen. You're the problem for remembering. And that's where it begins. Not with the trauma itself, but with the denial of the trauma. Because a child who can't trust their own perception of reality, that child learns to split themselves in two. One part that experiences, one part that survives, and the gap between those two parts, that's where madness takes root. Part 2. The embedding and long-term effects of trauma. Trauma doesn't just live in your memories. It lives in your body. It rewires your nervous system, teaching it to stay on high alert, to scan every room for danger, to interpret every raised voice as a threat. Your muscles hold it. Your breath patterns change around it. Your heart rate spikes at triggers you don't even consciously recognize. Carl Jung once wrote that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. Eli inherited his father's unprocessed rage, his mother's unacknowledged depression. Their ghosts became his ghosts. Their silences became his inner voice. By the time Eli was a teenager, he'd perfected the art of pretending. At school, he was charming, funny, the kid everyone liked but nobody really knew. He learned to read people, to become whatever they needed him to be. It was a survival skill that had saved him at home. Anticipate the mood, adjust accordingly, disappear into compliance. And it worked in the outside world too. But inside he was hollow. He'd look in the mirror and not recognize the person staring back. There was Eli, the performance. And there was the thing beneath Eli, the raw wound that never healed, the child still hiding in that bedroom with his hands over his ears. The split was complete. And when you live as two people for long enough, eventually you forget which one is real. That's when the symptoms start. That's when the mask begins to crack. Part 3. Gradual onset of symptoms and internal collapse. It started with insomnia. Eli would lie awake at 3 in the morning, his mind racing through conversations he'd had that day, analyzing every word he'd said, every expression on people's faces. Had he said something wrong? Did they see through him? Were they talking about him now, laughing at the fraud he was? Then came the paranoia. Not the clinical kind, not yet, but the creeping sense that everyone was watching, judging, waiting for him to fail. He'd replay interactions obsessively, finding hidden meanings in innocent comments, building elaborate theories about people's true intentions. The rage surprised him most. It would surge up from nowhere, white-hot and overwhelming, usually triggered by something trivial. Someone cutting him off in traffic. A friend canceling plans. He'd fantasize about screaming, about breaking things, about making people feel the pain he carried. But he never did. He swallowed it, shoved it down, smiled through clenched teeth. Relationships became impossible. He'd meet someone, feel a connection, and immediately sabotage it. Push them away before they could leave him. Test them with impossible standards. Create drama to feel something, anything, other than the numbness that was becoming his baseline. He tried therapy once in his mid-20s. The therapist was kind but surface level. "You have anxiety and depression," she told him, as if giving the monster a name would tame it. She prescribed medication, taught him breathing exercises, told him to practice gratitude. And it helped, a little, the way a Band-Aid helps a gunshot wound. It covered the thing but didn't touch it. Because nobody was asking the real question. Why? Why the insomnia? Why the rage? Why the emptiness? Nobody was looking at the 6-year-old boy with his hands over his ears, still trapped in that bedroom, still being told his reality wasn't real. The trauma was still there, fermenting in the dark. And when trauma goes unacknowledged long enough, it doesn't stay quiet. It starts to scream in the only language it knows: madness. Part 4. The nature of going crazy. Eli started talking to himself. Not just thinking out loud, but full conversations with voices that responded. He filled notebooks with frantic writing, pages and pages of words that poured out faster than his hand could move. The words spoke truths he'd never been allowed to say. "You did this to me. I didn't deserve this. I'm so angry. I'm so alone." He stopped showering regularly, stopped returning calls. The energy required to maintain the performance was gone. The mask didn't just crack, it shattered. And underneath was something that terrified even him. Here's what most people misunderstand about going crazy. It's not a sudden break. It's not waking up one day and suddenly being unable to function. It's the exhaustion of suppression. It's what happens when you've held the truth underwater for so long that it finally bursts through the surface, gasping and violent and impossible to ignore. Your psyche, when it fractures, is like a tapestry being torn. The threads don't just separate, they create new patterns, chaotic and strange. Eli started seeing meanings in everything. Numbers on license plates were messages. Songs on the radio were speaking directly to him. The universe was trying to communicate, to tell him something crucial if only he could decode it. Were these hallucinations? Delusions? Or was his mind, desperate for order in the chaos of his internal world, creating meaning where there was none? Society looked at Eli and saw a cautionary tale. Don't end up like him. He lost his mind. So sad what happened to him. They turned his suffering into spectacle, a story to tell at dinner parties, a reminder to be grateful for their own sanity. But Jung talked about something called individuation, the process of facing your shadow, integrating the parts of yourself you've rejected, becoming whole. What Eli was experiencing felt like the opposite. Not integration, but disintegration. Not facing the shadow, but drowning in it. Except, and this is crucial, what looks like drowning from the outside might actually be the first honest breath you've taken in years. Part 5. Psychological concepts: false self, shadow, and protest. The false self. a term psychologists use to describe the personality we construct for survival, had been Eli's entire existence. The charming, easygoing guy everyone thought they knew, that wasn't him. That was armor. That was camouflage. That was the price of admission to a world that demands you be okay even when you're not. When the false self cracked, what emerged was the shadow, all the rage, grief, terror, and shame he'd buried. The parts of himself too ugly, too needy, too real to show anyone. Jung said we all have a shadow, and the work of being human is to acknowledge it, to integrate it, not to pretend it doesn't exist. But Eli's shadow had been denied for so long that it didn't emerge gently. It erupted. It consumed. It became the only thing he could see. Some researchers believe that what we call madness is actually the soul's protest. It's what happens when your deepest self refuses to be silent anymore. When the child who was abused, neglected, and told he was imagining things finally finds a way to scream so loud that nobody, including you, can ignore him anymore. Eli's madness was that scream. The line between sanity and insanity blurred until it disappeared. Who's to say that his hallucinations weren't more real than the normal life he'd been living? At least in his madness, he was honest. At least in his breakdown, the truth was finally visible. I was abused. I was neglected. I was a child who needed love and got violence and silence instead. I didn't deserve this. The ghost of unhealed trauma haunts not just the person who experienced it, but everyone around them. It shapes how they love, how they work, how they see the world. Until it's faced, it runs the show from behind the curtain. And facing it, truly facing it, requires a kind of courage that our culture doesn't even have language for. It requires you to die and be reborn, not metaphorically, actually. Part 6, Path to Healing and Redemption. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Healing doesn't happen by pretending you're fine. It happens by descending into the wound and feeling, really feeling, everything you've been running from. For Eli, the turning point came in the chaos itself. In one of his notebooks, buried among the frantic scrawls, he found a sentence he'd written. "I didn't deserve this." 4 words, but they gave him something he'd never had before: permission. Permission to be angry, permission to grieve, permission to acknowledge that what happened to him was real and wrong and not his fault. He went back to therapy, but this time he didn't perform. He didn't try to be the good client who made progress and said the right things. He wept. He raged. He let the therapist see the parts of him that were ugly and broken and scared. And slowly, painfully slowly, he started to hear the voices of all the parts of himself he'd locked away. The 6-year-old who'd hidden in his bedroom, the teenager who'd perfected the mask, the young man who'd sabotaged every relationship. They all had something to say, and he needed to listen. Healing isn't linear. It's not fix yourself and move on. It's a constant practice of returning to the wound, of sitting with the pain instead of running from it, of choosing vulnerability even when every instinct screams to retreat back into the armor. Eli learned that his madness wasn't the enemy. It was the messenger. It was his psyche's last-ditch effort to get his attention, to force him to stop pretending and start feeling. And in the honesty of his breakdown, in the raw truth of his pain, he found something unexpected: hope. Not the shallow, greeting card kind, but the deep, hard-won knowledge that if he could survive this, if he could look directly at his shadow and not flinch, he could survive anything. But healing yourself isn't just for you, because the world doesn't need more people wearing masks. It needs people who have done the work, who have faced their shadows, who have come back from the edge with wisdom and light. Part 7, Advice for the Reader Audience. If you're reading this and you see yourself in Eli's story, hear this. You're not broken. You're buried. Buried under years of survival strategies that once saved you but now suffocate you. Buried under other people's voices telling you who you should be. Buried under trauma that never got a chance to be processed, to be witnessed, to be real. Here's what you can do. First, find moments of conscious silence. Not meditation where you try to empty your mind. That's too much when your mind is already screaming. Just silence where you let yourself hear what's actually there. Sit with it. Don't run. Second, write, scream, cry. Let the things you've been holding come out however they need to come out. Your body is keeping score even if your mind is pretending everything's fine. Give it permission to release. Third, read books that understand trauma at a deep level. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk will show you how trauma lives in your nervous system. Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert A. Johnson will teach you about the parts of yourself you've rejected. The Drama of the Gifted Child by Alice Miller will show you how childhood wounds shape your entire life. Man and His Symbols by Carl Jung will introduce you to the language of your unconscious. Fourth, find a therapist who gets it. Not someone who just wants to manage your symptoms, but someone who's willing to go into the dark with you. Someone trained in trauma. Someone who understands that healing isn't about becoming normal. It's about becoming whole. Fifth, remember that the goal isn't to be perfect. It's to be real. It's to look in the mirror and recognize yourself. Not the mask, not the performance. You. The work is hard. The work is painful. The work will make you feel like you're dying because parts of you are, the false parts, the protective parts that served you once but don't anymore. But on the other side is something worth fighting for. The ability to be authentically, messily, beautifully human. And when you do that work, when you integrate your shadow and come back from the edge, you become something the world desperately needs. Part 8. Incomplete Ending Call to Authenticity. Eli's story doesn't have a neat ending, because healing doesn't end. It evolves. He's still working on himself, still discovering new layers, still having hard days. But he's no longer pretending. He's no longer split in two. He knows his shadow, and he's learned to carry it with compassion instead of shame. The people who go through what Eli went through and do the work to heal, they come back with something. They come back with. The wound is the place where the light enters you. Rumi. What will you come back with?